The explosion ripped through the November night like the world was tearing apart. I was locking up my diner when the first blast lit up Riverside Apartments 3 blocks away, turning everything orange and black shadows dancing like demons against the brick walls. Then I saw him, a figure in torn clothes, running straight toward the flames, while everyone else scattered like leaves in a hurricane. What happened next would change everything we thought we knew about heroes and cowards, about who deserves our respect and who we choose to ignore. My name is Marcus Chen, and I have been running this all-night diner on 5th and Madison for 23 years. The neon sign outside flickers between all night and all night, depending on the weather, but the coffee is always hot and the door is always open. I came here from Vietnam in 1975 with nothing but scars, and hope served my time in the Army from 1978 to 1982 learned that some wounds never heal but some bonds never break. 23 years of watching this city change, watching people come and go, but I had never seen anything like what was about to unfold. The building burning was Riverside Apartments, one of those old brick structures that housed young families scraping by and elderly folks living on Social Security. 5 stories of people trying to make it through another day now, watching their lives go up in smoke. The fire trucks were screaming down Madison Avenue, but they were still minutes away, and the flames were already reaching for the 3rd-floor windows. You could hear the chaos from blocks away, sirens mixing with screams, people shouting names of loved ones, mothers calling for children who might be trapped inside. That is when I really noticed him for the first time. We all called him Ghost, though nobody knew his real name or bothered to ask. He had been living in the alley behind my diner for about 6 months, quiet as morning mist, never causing trouble, never asking for anything more than the scraps I sometimes left by the back door. Tall and lean, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair that hung past his shoulders and clothes that looked like they had survived several wars. Most people crossed the street when they saw him coming. Business owners complained to police about him being bad for the neighborhood image, and I had always felt guilty about not doing more to help. But tonight, Ghost was moving with a purpose I had never seen before, his body cutting through the crowd with the kind of precision that made my old Army instincts sit up and take notice. While everyone else was backing away from the building, creating a safe perimeter like sensible people do when faced with fire and destruction, Ghost was pushing forward, his eyes locked on those burning windows, with the focus of a man who had done this before. The way he moved, the way he assessed the building structure, the way he seemed to calculate angles and timing in his head, it all reminded me of something I could not quite place, but definitely recognized. I found myself following him, though I could not tell you exactly why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the same instinct that made me open a diner instead of working in an office, always wanting to be where people needed help. The heat hit me like a physical wall when I got within 50 feet of the building, and the smoke was thick enough to choke on. The firefighters were setting up their equipment, shouting orders and establishing protocols, doing everything by the book, while precious seconds ticked away. That is when we heard the baby crying from somewhere on the 3rd floor, a sound that cut through all the noise and chaos like a blade through silk. Every parent in that crowd looked up at those windows with pure terror in their eyes, because we all knew what that sound meant and how little time there might be left. The fire chief was on his radio, calling for more units, talking about ladder placement and water pressure, all the professional considerations that matter in situations like this. Ghost did not wait for ladders or water pressure or professional considerations. He walked past the firefighters like they were not even there and disappeared into the smoke-filled lobby. Just like that, no hesitation, no asking permission, no stopping to consider the risks or the protocols. The way he entered that building, the way he seemed to know exactly where he was going, told me this man had training that went far beyond whatever life had taught him on the streets. That is when Patricia Whitmore arrived like a tornado in designer clothes. You know the name if you live in this city, or at least you know her husband Richard, who owns half the downtown real estate and has his picture in the business section every other week. Patricia drives a white Mercedes that costs more than most people make in 2 years. And she treats charity work like other people treat hobbies, something to fill the time between social events and shopping trips. She came screeching up to the fire scene, nearly clipping 2 firefighters who had to jump out of her way, and exploded out of that, Mercedes wearing a coat that probably cost more than Ghost made in a year. The reason she was there, we found out later, was because her personal trainer lived in the building. Some 22-year-old fitness instructor named Brad, who helped her stay in shape for the country club events where she liked to be seen and photographed. Patricia started yelling at the fire chief about getting Brad out, immediately waving her phone around and threatening to call everyone from the mayor to the governor if her demands were not met right now. She had that particular brand of entitlement that comes from never having to face real consequences, the kind of confidence that money and social position can buy when you have never been tested by anything more serious than a delayed reservation at an expensive restaurant. The baby was still crying, getting weaker now, and you could see panic spreading through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Parents were pulling their own children closer. Elderly residents who had been evacuated from the lower floors stood there in nightgowns and slippers watching their home burn, and the whole scene felt like something from a nightmare where you can see the disaster coming but cannot move fast enough to prevent it. Then Ghost emerged from the building carrying an elderly woman over his shoulder like she weighed nothing at all. His clothes were singed, his face was black with soot, but he was moving steady and strong, like carrying people out of burning buildings was something he did every Tuesday. He set the woman down gently near the ambulances, said something to her in Spanish that made her nod and touch his face with gratitude, then turned around and headed back into the flames without even pausing to catch his breath. That is when Patricia completely lost whatever was left of her mind. She started pointing at Ghost and screaming about how a dirty homeless man was contaminating the rescue operation, how he was probably making things more dangerous for everyone, how someone needed to arrest him before he caused more problems. She actually used the word contaminate like Ghost was some kind of disease, instead of the only person brave enough to go inside and actually save people while the rest of us stood around watching. The crowd started murmuring, some people nodding along with Patricia's complaints, because it is easier to agree with the rich lady than to think for yourself. Others looking uncomfortable, but not willing to speak up against someone with her social position. I felt sick watching it happen because here was a man risking everything to help strangers, and all Patricia could think about was her own prejudices and social anxieties. But Ghost kept going back into that building 4 more times while the firefighters were still getting their equipment positioned each time, bringing out someone else who might have died without his intervention. A young mother named Maria carrying twin toddlers, an elderly man in a wheelchair who could never have made it out on his own, and finally that baby we had all heard crying wrapped in a singed pink blanket but alive and breathing. Each time Ghost emerged from the flames, the crowd would cheer and applaud, recognizing genuine heroism when they saw it, despite Patricia's complaints. And each time he went back in, Patricia would find something new to criticize, some fresh reason why this homeless man was making everything worse instead of better. His methods were dangerous, he was not following safety protocols, he was setting a bad example for the children in the crowd. By the time the firefighters had their ladders up and their hoses flowing, Ghost had personally saved 7 people from that burning building. He was coughing badly by then, his hands were burned and bleeding, and he could barely stand straight from the smoke he had inhaled. But he kept checking, kept making sure everyone was accounted for, kept putting other people's safety ahead of his own exhaustion and pain. That is when Patricia's precious trainer, Brad, finally appeared stumbling out of the building under his own power, with nothing worse than a twisted ankle. Turned out he had been hiding in his bathroom the whole time, too scared to help anyone else or even call out to let people know where he was. The first thing he did when he saw Patricia was start complaining about his ruined apartment and asking about insurance coverage. Not a word of thanks for the man who had risked everything, while Brad cowered behind a locked door. The contrast was so stark it would have been funny if lives had not been at stake. Here was Ghost bloodied and exhausted from saving 7 people, and there was Brad worried about his security deposit and his exercise equipment. Patricia immediately rushed to Brad's side, fussing over his minor injury and demanding that paramedics examine him for trauma, while Ghost quietly sat down on the curb and tried to catch his breath. The injustice of it made my chest tight with anger. As the firefighters finally got the blaze under control and the last residents were evacuated safely, I walked over to where Ghost was sitting. Up close, I could see something in his eyes that I recognized from my own mirror after coming back from overseas, something that spoke of training and discipline and experiences that most people could not imagine. The way he held himself, even while exhausted, the way his eyes continued scanning the crowd for potential threats, the way his hands moved in small controlled gestures, all of it screamed military to anyone who knew what to look for. What I was about to discover would change everything, not just about how we saw Ghost, but about how we saw ourselves and the kind of community we really were underneath all the politeness and social conventions. Because sometimes the people we step over on our way to more important things are carrying stories that would humble us all, and sometimes it takes a disaster to reveal who people really are when the masks come off. The question that kept echoing in my mind as I watched Ghost disappear back into the alley behind my diner was simple but haunting. If we had known then what we were about to learn about this man's past, would any of us have treated him differently from the very beginning? I could not sleep after what I had witnessed, so by 5 in the morning I was back at the diner, making coffee, and trying to understand what I had seen. The way Ghost moved through that building was not luck or desperation, it was muscle memory from years of training. Every step calculated, every decision made, with the kind of precision that only comes from doing something so many times it becomes automatic. I had seen that same controlled movement in my army buddies, the way soldiers carry themselves even decades after leaving the service. When Ghost appeared at my back door just after sunrise, I was ready for him. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth torn from his shirt, his face still streaked with soot, but his eyes were alert and scanning the alley like he expected trouble. I poured 2 cups of coffee and stepped outside without saying anything, offering him one like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked surprised, like kindness was a language he had forgotten how to speak. We stood there drinking coffee in the early morning light, watching the city wake up around us. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, and you could see the blackened skeleton of Riverside Apartments in the distance, but somehow the world felt different than it had 12 hours earlier. Finally, I spoke, keeping my voice quiet and steady, the way I had learned to talk to other veterans who were carrying heavy loads. I told him my name, told him about coming here from Vietnam in 1975, about serving in the army and recognizing something familiar in the way he moved. I did not ask questions, did not demand explanations, just shared my own story and waited to see if he would trust me with his. The silence stretched between us, but it was not uncomfortable, more like 2 old soldiers taking the measure of each other. When Ghost finally spoke, his voice was rough from smoke and years of not having many people to talk to, but there was something underneath the damage that confirmed what I already suspected. He told me his name was James Sullivan, that people in his unit had called him Ghost because he could move through enemy territory without making a sound. Captain James Sullivan, United States Navy SEALs, 15 years of service that had taken him to places most Americans only see on the news. As Sullivan talked, the pieces started falling into place. The precision I had witnessed was not just military training, it was special operations training, the kind that turns ordinary soldiers into something closer to human weapons. He had been a team leader, he said, responsible for urban combat and rescue operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. His specialty was getting people out of buildings that other people considered death traps. The medals came later, he explained. Silver Star for valor, Bronze Star for service, Purple Heart for wounds that left scars you could not see as easily as the ones on his hands. But the commendations and ceremonies felt hollow when measured against the weight of the men who did not make it home, the teammates who died so that others could live. Success in his line of work was measured by how many people survived, not by how many ribbons got pinned to your chest. Sullivan started to tell me about his last deployment, the one that had broken something inside him that all the medals and therapy sessions could not fix. Afghanistan, 2018. A mission that started as routine extraction and ended with half his team in body bags. The target was a group of American contractors who had been caught in a terrorist attack, civilians whose only mistake was being in the wrong place when the shooting started. The IED had taken out their convoy on a road that was supposed to be secure, leaving 3 Americans trapped in a bombed-out building while insurgents moved in to finish the job. Sullivan's team had gone in fast and hard the way they had done hundreds of times before, but this time everything went wrong. The building was rigged with secondary explosives, the exit routes were compromised, and by the time they got the contractors out, 2 of his best men were dead. Staff Sergeant Davis and Petty Officer Rodriguez Sullivan said their names like a prayer he had been repeating for years. Good men with families back home, soldiers who had trusted their team leader to bring them through another mission alive. They had died covering the evacuation, buying time for Sullivan to carry the wounded contractor to safety while bullets sparked off the concrete around them. The contractor had been terrified. Sullivan remembered crying and shaking as Sullivan dragged him through 200 yards of active combat zone. The man kept saying he was going to die, that he was sorry for getting American soldiers killed, that he wished he had never come to Afghanistan in the first place. Sullivan had done what he always did, stayed calm and professional, focused on the mission instead of the emotions. At the field hospital later that night, the contractor had been so grateful he could barely speak. Richard something Sullivan thought his name was some businessman involved in construction projects for the military. The man had been pumped full of morphine, but kept insisting that he would never forget what Sullivan and his team had done, that he would make sure Davis and Rodriguez were remembered, that he would take care of Sullivan's family when they all got back to the States. Sullivan had given the man his contact information, not because he expected anything, but because the contractor had seemed so desperate to find some way to repay the debt he felt he owed. It was not about money or favors, Sullivan explained to me. It was about letting someone who had been saved know that the sacrifice had meaning, that good men had not died for nothing. But coming home had been harder than any deployment Sullivan had ever experienced. The nightmares started in the military hospital and never really stopped. Images of Davis and Rodriguez bleeding out while he carried someone else to safety. The guilt was like poison in his veins, the knowledge that he had survived while better men had not, that families had lost fathers and husbands because of decisions he had made as team leader. The drinking started as medication, something to help him sleep, without seeing his teammates die over and over again. The VA doctors prescribed pills that made him feel like he was underwater, but the alcohol was faster and more reliable, at least until it stopped working and started making everything worse. His wife tried to understand, tried to help, but how do you explain combat trauma to someone who has never been in a war zone? The marriage fell apart slowly, then all at once. His daughter stopped calling his wife, filed for divorce, and Sullivan found himself alone with memories that felt more real than the present. The security jobs he tried to hold down became impossible when the PTSD made him unreliable, when loud noises sent him diving for cover, and crowds made him scan for threats that were not there. About a year after he got back, Sullivan had tried to contact the contractor he had saved, partly out of desperation, and partly because the man had seemed so sincere about wanting to help. He called the number on the business card several times, but was always told that Mr. Whitmore was in meetings, or traveling, or too busy to take calls from former military personnel. The message was clear enough, and Sullivan had too much pride to keep calling someone who did not want to be bothered. As Sullivan finished his story, I felt something cold settle in my stomach like a lead weight. The name he had mentioned, Richard Whitmore, was not just familiar to me from business news or charity events. I had served coffee to Richard Whitmore dozens of times over the years, had watched him glad hand with local veterans organizations, had seen him accept awards for his support of military causes. The same Richard Whitmore, whose wife had been screaming about contamination, while the man who saved his life risked everything to help strangers. I asked Sullivan if he was sure about the name, if he remembered what the contractor looked like, if there were any other details that might help identify him. Sullivan described a man in his 40s, brown hair, expensive clothes, even in a war zone. Someone who clearly had money and education and had never been in real danger before that day in Kabul. The description matched perfectly with the Richard Whitmore I knew, the real estate developer who owned half the downtown area and whose wife drove a Mercedes that cost more than most people made in years. The irony was so bitter I could taste it like ash in my mouth. Here was Sullivan living in my alley and being treated like human garbage, while the man whose life he had saved built an empire and collected awards for supporting veterans. But there was more to the story, and it was worse than I had imagined. As we talked, Sullivan mentioned that he had been keeping an eye on some of the buildings in the downtown area, not out of any particular interest, but because he noticed things that other people missed. The Riverside Apartments had been a concern for months, he said, because the electrical system was clearly overloaded and the emergency exits were blocked or poorly marked. Sullivan had actually tried to report his concerns to city inspectors, but his status as a homeless veteran meant that his complaints were dismissed or ignored entirely. Nobody wanted to hear safety warnings from someone living on the streets, especially when those warnings might cost property owners money. So Sullivan had done what he could, which was to monitor the building and hope that his fears were unfounded. When I told Sullivan that the Riverside building was owned by Whitmore Properties, he went very still and quiet. The look that crossed his face was not anger exactly, more like confirmation of something he had already suspected but hoped was not true. The man he had saved in Afghanistan, the contractor who had promised never to forget, was not just ignoring Sullivan's existence, but actively profiting from the kind of negligence that put innocent people in danger. The morning sun was getting higher, and my regular customers were starting to arrive for breakfast, but I could not let this conversation end without understanding the full scope of what had happened. Sullivan had been protecting the tenants of Richard Whitmore's building, trying to prevent the kind of disaster that his military training told him was inevitable. When the fire finally started, Sullivan had been ready because he had been expecting it for months. As Sullivan prepared to disappear back into the shadows of the alley, I made him a promise. I told him that some debts were too important to be forgotten, that some stories needed to be told, even when powerful people would prefer they stay buried. I did not know exactly what I was going to do with the information he had shared, but I knew that the man who had saved 7 people from a burning building deserved better than living on the streets, while the person he had rescued in Afghanistan collected awards for supporting veterans. Sullivan looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to decide whether to trust someone else with his story after being disappointed so many times before. Finally, he nodded and walked away, but something had changed between us. He was no longer just the homeless man who lived behind my diner, and I was no longer just the guy who sometimes left food by the back door. We were 2 veterans who understood that some obligations go deeper than social conventions or business considerations. The question that haunted me as I watched Sullivan disappear was not whether Richard Whitmore would face consequences for his betrayal, but whether our community had the courage to demand accountability from people who claimed to support our veterans while abandoning the ones who needed help the most. I waited until Tuesday afternoon to make the call, giving myself time to think about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. Richard Whitmore was not the kind of man you confronted without preparation, especially when you were accusing him of abandoning the soldier who had saved his life. But some conversations cannot be avoided forever, and some truths need to be spoken regardless of the consequences. The receptionist at Whitmore Properties tried to brush me off, at first explaining that Mr. Whitmore was very busy with important meetings and did not take unsolicited calls. I told her to mention that I was calling about Captain James Sullivan and the fire at Riverside Apartments. She put me on hold for less than 30 seconds before Richard himself came on the line, his voice tight with something that might have been fear. We agreed to meet at my diner after closing time, when we could talk privately without customers or employees listening in. Richard arrived exactly on time, driving a black BMW that probably cost more than I made in 2 years. He looked older than his newspaper photos, with gray starting to show at his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping well since the fire. He sat across from me in the corner booth, his expensive suit looking out of place in my working-class diner, his hands folded on the table like he was trying to keep them from shaking. I poured coffee for both of us, taking my time, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Finally, I asked him if he remembered Captain Sullivan from Afghanistan. Richard's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His face went pale, and his shoulders sagged like someone had just confirmed his worst fears. He started to say something about not being sure about overseas experiences, blurring together over time, but the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on my face. I told him that Sullivan had described the rescue in detail, including the names of the 2 SEALs who had died getting Richard to safety. That was when Richard broke down and told me the truth about what had happened in Kabul and what had happened since. The story came out in pieces, interrupted by long silences and moments when he seemed to be fighting back tears. It was not the story of a grateful man honoring the sacrifice of his rescuers. It was the story of a coward who had spent 5 years trying to forget the day he had been saved by better men than himself. Richard described the convoy attack with the kind of detail that only comes from reliving something over and over again in nightmares. The explosion had flipped their armored vehicle and left him trapped under twisted metal with his leg pinned and bleeding. He could hear gunfire getting closer, could smell diesel fuel and burning rubber, could feel panic rising in his throat like bile. For the first time in his privileged life, Richard Whitmore had faced the possibility of dying violently and alone. When Sullivan's team arrived, Richard had been crying and praying and promising God that he would be a better person if he could just survive the next few minutes. He watched Sullivan assess the situation with professional calm, organizing the extraction, while bullets sparked off the concrete around them. The captain had personally carried Richard through 200 yards of active combat, shielding him with his own body when sniper fire erupted from a nearby building. But what haunted Richard most was not the fear he had felt during the attack, it was the shame he had carried ever since. He had seen real courage that day, had watched Sullivan and his team risk everything to save strangers, had witnessed the kind of heroism that most people only read about in books. By comparison, his own behavior had been pathetic and cowardly, and he had never been able to forget the contrast. The guilt had followed Richard home from Afghanistan like a shadow he could not shake. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the man who had cried and begged while warriors died for him. Every business success felt hollow when measured against the sacrifice that Davis and Rodriguez had made. Every award or recognition he received for his veteran support work felt like a lie, because he knew what he really was underneath all the public relations. When Sullivan had called looking for help, Richard had panicked. Hearing the captain's voice brought back all the memories he had been trying to suppress, all the fear and shame and inadequacy he had felt that day in Kabul. But worse than the memories was the realization that Sullivan represented a threat to the carefully constructed image Richard had built for himself as a successful businessman and community leader. Richard admitted that he had been avoiding Sullivan for almost a year, taking different routes to work and changing his schedule to avoid any chance encounters. It was not that he wished Sullivan harm, he insisted it was just that seeing the man who had saved his life reminded Richard of things he preferred to forget. The homeless veteran sleeping in alleys was living proof of Richard's own cowardice and ingratitude. As Richard talked, I found myself getting angrier with each revelation. This was not just about one man abandoning another. It was about the complete moral bankruptcy of someone who had been given a second chance at life and had chosen to waste it on selfishness and greed. But there was more to the story, and it was worse than anything I had imagined. Richard owned the Riverside Apartments through a shell company that allowed him to hide his involvement in properties that did not meet his usual standards for public association. The building had been purchased specifically as a profit center with maintenance and safety expenses cut to the absolute minimum. Richard knew the electrical system was dangerous, knew the fire exits were inadequate, knew the whole structure was a disaster waiting to happen. The fire inspector who had signed off on the building's safety certificates was on Richard's payroll, along with several other city officials who helped him navigate around building codes and safety regulations. It was a system of corruption that had been operating for years, allowing Richard to extract maximum profit from properties while shifting the risk to tenants who had no idea they were living in death traps. Richard had known that Sullivan was monitoring the building, had actually seen him in the area several times during his route changes. He had assumed Sullivan was just another homeless person looking for shelter, never imagining that the man was actually trying to protect the people Richard was putting at risk. The irony was so profound that it made Richard physically sick to think about it. When I asked Richard why he had continued with the unsafe practices even after he knew Sullivan was in the area, his answer revealed the full extent of his moral collapse. He said that acknowledging Sullivan would have meant acknowledging his own debt and shame, would have forced him to confront the kind of man he had become since returning from Afghanistan. It was easier to pretend Sullivan did not exist than to face the judgment of someone who had seen him at his weakest moment. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it I understood that Richard Whitmore was not just a businessman who had made some questionable decisions. He was a man who had been broken by his own cowardice, and had spent years trying to bury that brokenness under money and status and public recognition. Sullivan represented everything Richard was, not everything he wished he could be, but lacked the courage to become. As Richard prepared to leave, I told him that his secret was not going to stay buried much longer. The fire had attracted too much attention. The building ownership was a matter of public record, and people were starting to ask questions about how a decorated war hero had ended up homeless, while the city's most prominent veteran supporter lived in a mansion. Richard nodded, like he had been expecting this moment for years. But what Richard did not know, what I was not ready to tell him yet, was that his wife Patricia had been conducting her own investigation into Sullivan's background. She had been asking questions about the homeless hero who had saved lives at the fire, and it was only a matter of time before she discovered the connection between her husband and the man she had tried to have arrested. When that happened, Richard's carefully constructed world was going to come crashing down in ways that would make the Riverside fire look like a small kitchen accident. The question that hung in the air as Richard drove away in his expensive car was not whether the truth would come out, but whether he would have the courage to face it when it did. Some secrets are too big to stay hidden forever, and some debts are too important to be forgotten by the people who matter most. I spent the rest of that night thinking about Sullivan sleeping in the alley behind my diner, protecting a community that had rejected him, while the man whose life he had saved profited from putting that same community at risk. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to wait for the truth to emerge naturally or to help it along, whether to trust that justice would find its own way, or to make sure it had some assistance from people who understood the difference between heroism and cowardice. Patricia Whitmore had always prided herself on being thorough, which is why she found herself unable to stop researching the homeless man who had dominated the news coverage for the past 3 days. Something about his story felt incomplete, like there were pieces missing that would make sense of why a decorated Navy SEAL had ended up sleeping in alleys while the city celebrated his heroism after the fact. By Thursday morning, she had compiled everything she could find about Captain James Sullivan. Military service records, medal citations, newspaper articles about his deployments, even social media posts from other veterans who remembered serving with him. The picture that emerged was of a genuine American hero who had somehow fallen through every safety net the system was supposed to provide for people like him. What bothered Patricia most was not just the tragedy of Sullivan's circumstances, but the nagging feeling that she had encountered his name somewhere before. Not from the news coverage, but from some other context that her mind kept trying to retrieve. She found herself studying his photograph, looking for some clue that would explain why this stranger felt familiar in a way that made her stomach uneasy. The breakthrough came when she discovered an archive newspaper story from 3 years earlier about military contractors returning from Afghanistan. The article included a photograph of a medal ceremony, and there in the background, shaking hands with Captain Sullivan, was her husband Richard. The caption identified Richard as one of several contractors whose lives had been saved during a terrorist attack with Sullivan, listed as the team leader responsible for the rescue. Patricia stared at the photograph for a long time, her morning coffee growing cold as the implications slowly penetrated her carefully constructed worldview. The homeless man she had demanded be arrested was the same person who had carried her husband to safety in a war zone. The hero she had called a contamination risk was someone to whom her family owed a debt that could never be repaid. Her first reaction was denial, a desperate hope that this was some kind of mistake or misidentification. Maybe there were multiple James Sullivans in the Navy, maybe the photograph was mislabeled, maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the more she examined the image, the more certain she became. The bone structure was identical, the military bearing was unmistakable, even the way he held his hand during the ceremony matched the precise movements she had observed at the fire. Patricia called Richard's office, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting in her mind. When his assistant said he was in meetings, Patricia insisted it was an emergency that could not wait. She was transferred immediately, which told her that Richard had been expecting this call, even if he had been hoping it would never come. She asked him directly whether he had ever heard of Captain James Sullivan, whether the name meant anything to him, whether there was any reason she should know about a connection between her husband and the homeless hero from the fire. The silence on Richard's end stretched so long that Patricia began to wonder if the call had been dropped. When Richard finally spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. He asked her where she had heard that name, what she had been reading, why she was asking questions about things that had happened years ago in places she had never been. The evasiveness in his tone confirmed what Patricia had already begun to suspect. She told him about the photograph, about the medal ceremony, about the rescue operation that had apparently saved his life, along with several other contractors in 2018. She asked him why he had never mentioned being rescued by Navy SEALs, why the most dramatic event of his overseas experience had never come up in their conversations about Afghanistan. Richard's explanation was a masterpiece of deflection and half-truths. He claimed that he had not wanted to worry her with the details of dangerous situations, that he preferred to focus on moving forward, rather than dwelling on traumatic memories. He suggested that she was probably making connections that did not really exist, that overseas experiences tend to blur together over time, that she should not read too much into random photographs from military events. But Patricia had not survived 20 years of marriage to a businessman without learning to recognize when someone was lying to her. She pressed harder, asking Richard to explain why he seemed so uncomfortable discussing what should have been a positive memory, a story of heroism and survival that any reasonable person would be eager to share. That was when Richard made his crucial mistake. Under pressure to provide some explanation for his evasiveness, he mentioned almost casually that he thought he remembered the captain having some kind of drinking problem, that there had been rumors about PTSD and behavioral issues that had made him someone you would not want to stay in contact with over the long term. The specificity of that information, the casual way Richard dismissed Sullivan's service-related mental health struggles, told Patricia everything she needed to know about how well her husband actually remembered the man who had saved in his life. She asked him directly whether Sullivan had ever tried to contact him after they returned to the United States, whether there had been any follow-up communication or attempts to maintain the connection. Richard's answer was another lie, wrapped in false uncertainty. He claimed that he could not really remember that overseas experiences tend to fade over time, that he had been focused on rebuilding his business and had not maintained contact with military personnel. But his voice carried the particular quality that Patricia had learned to associate with her husband's most desperate deceptions. She hung up the phone feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet, not just because of what she had learned about Sullivan, but because of how easily Richard had lied to her about something so important. She spent the rest of the afternoon going through Richard's home office looking for any evidence of contact with Sullivan or any indication that Richard had been aware of the captain's current circumstances. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. Richard's appointment calendar showed a pattern of route changes over the past 8 months, detours that made no sense unless he was deliberately avoiding specific areas of downtown. His credit card statements included charges at gas stations and parking meters that were far from his usual locations, suggesting he had been going out of his way to travel through different parts of the city. But the most damaging piece of evidence was tucked into Richard's desk drawer, a business card that had been handled so many times. The edges were soft and the printing was faded. Captain James Sullivan, it read, followed by a phone number written in the precise block letters that the military teaches its personnel. The card was proof that Richard had not only maintained Sullivan's contact information, but had been carrying it with him, looking at it, probably struggling with guilt about not using it. Patricia sat in Richard's study, holding that business card and trying to understand how her husband could have hidden something so fundamental about himself for so many years. The man she had married was not just someone who had forgotten to help a veteran in need. He was someone who had deliberately abandoned the person who had saved his life while building a public reputation as a supporter of military causes. When Richard came home that evening, Patricia was waiting for him in his study with the business card placed in the center of his desk like evidence in a courtroom. She watched the color drain from his face as he realized that his secret was finally exposed, that the careful compartmentalization he had maintained for years was about to collapse. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in their 20-year marriage. Patricia demanded to know how long he had known that Sullivan was homeless, how many times he had seen the man who saved his life sleeping on the streets while Richard slept in their mansion. She wanted to understand how someone could live with that level of ingratitude and moral cowardice. Richard's confession came in pieces, interrupted by long silences and moments when he seemed to be fighting back tears. He talked about shame and reputation, about not knowing how to help someone with problems he did not understand, about being afraid that his connection to Sullivan might reflect poorly on his business if it became public knowledge. Every excuse was a variation on the same theme, that his own comfort and success were more important than honoring the debt he owed to the man who had made both possible. But what devastated Patricia was not just the scope of Richard's betrayal, it was the realization that she had participated in it without knowing. Her behavior at the fire, her demands that Sullivan be arrested, her casual dismissal of his heroism, all of it had been directed at someone who deserved the exact opposite treatment from her family. She had insulted and demeaned the man who had carried her husband to safety, while better men died to make that rescue possible. As Patricia sat in that study, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's moral bankruptcy, she felt something fundamental change inside her. The comfortable assumptions that had guided her life for decades suddenly seemed hollow and false, built on a foundation of privilege that she had never bothered to examine. For the first time in her adult life, she was forced to confront the possibility that everything she thought she knew about right and wrong might be completely backwards. That night, Patricia lay awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Davis and Rodriguez, the two SEALs who had died in the operation that saved her husband. She wondered what their families would think if they knew how Richard had honored their sacrifice, how he had repaid the debt their loved ones had died to create. She wondered what kind of person she had become, that she could live so comfortably while ignoring the suffering of someone who had given her husband a second chance at life. The question that would torment her through the sleepless hours until dawn was simple but devastating. If she could so easily participate in the abandonment of someone who had literally saved her husband's life, what did that say about the kind of person she really was underneath all the charity work and social respectability? Maria Gonzalez posted the video at 6:30 Friday morning, 37 seconds of shaky phone footage that would change everything for everyone involved. She had filmed Sullivan's final rescue from her third-floor window, capturing the moment he emerged from the smoke carrying a baby, while flames reached for him like hungry fingers. The caption was simple but devastating. "This homeless hero saved my babies and 6 other people while we all stood watching. His name is Captain James Sullivan, and he deserves better than sleeping in alleys." Within hours, the hashtag #GhostHeroSullivan was trending across every social media platform. The video had been shared 50,000 times by noon, picked up by national news networks by evening, and spawned a dozen copycat posts from other people who had witnessed the rescue. Sullivan's story had everything that modern media craved: heroism, tragedy, injustice, and a visual that burned itself into viewers' memories. Patricia watched the explosion of attention from her living room, her phone buzzing constantly, with calls from friends who wanted to know if she had seen the incredible story about the homeless veteran. Each notification felt like another weight settling on her chest, because she knew that it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots between the hero everyone was celebrating and her husband's business empire. The connection came faster than she had expected. By Friday afternoon, investigative reporters had confirmed that Riverside Apartments was owned by Whitmore Properties, and that the building had a history of safety violations that had been overlooked by city inspectors. What had started as a human interest story about a homeless hero was rapidly becoming a scandal about corporate negligence and regulatory corruption. Richard spent Friday evening in crisis mode, calling lawyers and public relations specialists, trying to figure out how to contain a story that seemed to be growing larger and more dangerous by the hour. But every strategy his advisors suggested seemed flawed. Every potential statement seemed likely to make things worse. Acknowledging the connection to Sullivan would raise questions about why they had not helped him, but denying it would make them look dishonest when the truth inevitably emerged. Saturday morning brought news that made Richard's situation exponentially worse. The Associated Press had obtained military records confirming that Sullivan had personally led the rescue operation that saved Richard's life in Afghanistan, and that 2 members of Sullivan's team had been killed during the mission. The story now had everything: corporate greed, veteran abandonment, personal betrayal, and the ultimate irony of a hero saving people from a building owned by the man whose life he had previously saved. The backlash was swift and merciless. Veterans organizations began organizing protests outside Whitmore properties. Offices, social media exploded with outrage about corporate executives who exploited unsafe housing, while the heroes who saved their lives lived on the streets, and business partners started distancing themselves from anything connected to the Whitmore name. But the moment that defined the weekend came when CNN obtained an interview with Sullivan himself. He had agreed to speak with Anderson Cooper after days of hiding from the media attention, and the promotional clips showed him looking directly into the camera with the kind of steady intensity that reminded viewers why his fellow SEALs had called him Ghost. In the interview, Sullivan spoke with quiet dignity about his service, his struggle with PTSD, and his current circumstances. But what captured national attention was his response when Cooper asked about Richard Whitmore's failure to help him after Afghanistan. Sullivan said that he had never expected personal gratitude from the people he rescued, that soldiers do their job because it needs to be done, not because they expect rewards afterward. What bothered him, Sullivan explained, was not Richard's individual ingratitude, but the broader pattern of a society that celebrated military service in speeches and ceremonies while ignoring military veterans in practice. He talked about the hundreds of homeless veterans living on the streets of every American city, about the inadequate mental health services and job training programs, about the gap between public support for the military and practical support for people who had served. The interview also included a revelation that stunned everyone following the story. Sullivan admitted that he had known Richard owned the Riverside building, that he had been monitoring the property for months because he was concerned about safety violations he had observed. He had tried to report his concerns to city inspectors, but his status as a homeless veteran meant that his warnings were dismissed or ignored. The night of the fire, Sullivan said, was not the first time he had considered what he would do if the building's faulty electrical system finally caused the disaster he had been predicting. He had been watching over the tenants of Richard's building, trying to protect people that Richard's negligence was endangering, despite having every reason to resent the man who had abandoned him. The implications of Sullivan's admission created a media firestorm that made the previous coverage look restrained. Here was a man who had been actively protecting the tenants of a building owned by someone who had refused to help him, continuing to serve a community that had rejected him, while the person whose life he had saved profited from putting that same community at risk. Monday morning brought the news that Patricia had been dreading. Federal prosecutors announced they were opening a criminal investigation into building safety violations and potential racketeering charges related to the systematic bribery of city officials. The investigation would examine not just the Riverside building, but the entire Whitmore Properties portfolio and the network of corruption that had enabled Richard's business practices. The announcement triggered a feeding frenzy that made the previous media attention look gentle by comparison. Every aspect of the Whitmore family's life was now under scrutiny, from their charitable donations to their political connections to their social activities. Patricia found herself trapped in her own home, unable to leave without facing protesters, and reporters unable to stay without confronting the evidence of her husband's moral collapse. Tuesday afternoon brought the call that would force Patricia to make the most difficult decision of her life. The woman on the phone identified herself as Captain Sarah Martinez, a Marine Corps veteran who ran a nonprofit organization supporting homeless veterans. Martinez had been following the story and wanted to offer Patricia a chance to do something meaningful with the wreckage of her reputation and marriage. Martinez explained that the veteran community was not interested in vengeance for its own sake, but they were demanding acknowledgement and accountability. If Patricia was willing to tell the complete truth about Sullivan and her family's connection to him, to publicly honor his service and sacrifice, and to commit meaningful resources to supporting homeless veterans, there might be a path towards something resembling redemption. The conversation forced Patricia to confront the choice that had been building since the night she discovered Richard's business card in his desk drawer. She could continue protecting her husband and preserving what remained of their wealth and social status, or she could finally do the right thing and accept the consequences of years of willful blindness and moral cowardice. That evening, Patricia sat in her study looking at the phone number Captain Martinez had given her for scheduling a press conference. Outside her window, she could see the protesters holding vigil with signs honoring Sullivan and demanding justice for homeless veterans. The comfortable world of charity, galas, and social privilege was gone, forever destroyed by the revelation of what her family had really been while they were pretending to support the very people they were abandoning. The decision she made in the next few hours would determine not just her own future, but whether there was any possibility of justice for Sullivan and accountability for the systematic failures that had enabled his abandonment. She understood that choosing the truth would cost her everything she had built over the past 20 years, but choosing lies would cost her the only thing she had left that might still be worth saving. As Patricia picked up the phone to call Captain Martinez, she thought about Davis and Rodriguez, the two young men who had died, so that her husband could live to build an empire on the foundation of their sacrifice. She thought about Sullivan sleeping in alleys while she slept in silk sheets, protecting strangers while she protected only herself. She thought about the kind of person she wanted to be when this was all over, assuming there would be anything left of her, when the truth finished burning through the lies. The question that had tormented her for days suddenly seemed simple. If she could not find the courage to honor the sacrifice of the men who had died for her husband, if she could not face the judgment of the man who had saved his life, then what was the point of any life she might preserve by continuing to hide from the truth? Wednesday morning brought the kind of media circus that usually surrounded presidential scandals or celebrity trials. 17 news vans lined the street outside the downtown Civic Center, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray November clouds that matched the mood of everyone involved. Patricia sat in the green room behind the auditorium, her hands shaking slightly as she reviewed the statement she had written and rewritten a dozen times the night before. The decision to hold this press conference had cost Patricia everything she had spent 20 years building. Richard had served her with divorce papers the moment she announced her intention to tell the complete truth, his lawyers already working to distance him from anything she might say. Her friends had stopped returning calls, charitable organizations had quietly removed her from their boards, and the social circle that had defined her identity had evaporated like morning mist. But sitting in the front row of the auditorium wearing his dress blue uniform despite being retired from active duty was Captain James Sullivan. He had agreed to attend at Captain Martinez's request, though he had made it clear that he expected nothing from Patricia and that his presence should not be interpreted as forgiveness. His eyes steady and alert despite everything he had endured gave Patricia the courage she needed to walk to the podium. She began with the complete truth about the night of the fire, acknowledging her shameful treatment of the man who had been risking his life to save others. She described her horror at discovering Sullivan's identity and her growing understanding of the debt her family owed to him. She admitted to the lies she had told in her television interviews and apologized directly to the veteran community for the disrespect she had shown to one of their own. The most difficult part of her statement was the detailed account of Richard's deliberate abandonment of Sullivan despite knowing about his circumstances for almost a year. She described finding the business card in Richard's desk, the evidence of route changes designed to avoid encountering Sullivan, and the systematic way Richard had ignored the man who had saved his life while building his reputation as a supporter of military causes. When Patricia finished reading her prepared statement, the questions from reporters came fast and unforgiving. They wanted to know why she had waited so long to come forward, whether she was cooperating with federal investigators, and what she planned to do to make amends for her family's actions. Patricia answered each question directly and honestly, accepting responsibility for her role in the cover-up and expressing her intention to dedicate whatever resources she retained to supporting homeless veterans. The most pointed question came from a reporter representing Military Times who asked Patricia whether she expected forgiveness from the veteran community after participating in what amounted to a betrayal of someone who had saved her husband's life. Patricia's response was the most honest moment of the entire press conference. She said that she did not expect or deserve forgiveness, that she understood the harm she had caused was not something that could be erased with apologies or charitable donations. After the formal questions ended, Patricia did something that surprised everyone in the auditorium. She walked down from the podium to where Sullivan was sitting, and in full view of the cameras and the crowd knelt beside his chair. The gesture was not calculated for media effect. It was simply the physical expression of the respect and humility she should have shown from the beginning. Patricia spoke to Sullivan quietly, her words intended for him rather than the microphones, but audible enough for those nearby to hear. She thanked him for saving her husband's life, for the sacrifice of his teammates Davis and Rodriguez, and for his continued service to a community that had failed him so completely. She acknowledged that her words could not undo the damage that had been done, but she wanted him to know that his service mattered and that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Sullivan's response was characteristically gracious and measured. He helped Patricia to her feet and thanked her for having the courage to tell the truth, even when it had cost her everything she had built. He said that accountability was the first step toward healing both for individuals and for communities, and that her willingness to face the consequences of her actions gave him hope that meaningful change might be possible. The press conference was immediately followed by a memorial service that Captain Martinez had organized to honor Staff Sergeant Davis and Petty Officer Rodriguez, the two SEALs who had been killed during the Kabul rescue operation. The ceremony was held at the Downtown Veterans Memorial, and it included not just Sullivan and Patricia, but representatives from military organizations across the region who had come to pay their respects. During the memorial service, Patricia announced the establishment of the Davis Rodriguez Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would be funded entirely from her personal assets and dedicated to providing housing and support services for homeless veterans. The foundation would be managed by veterans organizations with complete transparency to ensure that resources reached the people who needed them most. Richard's fate was sealed by Patricia's testimony and the federal investigation that followed. Within a week, he was indicted on multiple charges, including racketeering, bribery of public officials, and criminal negligence, resulting in public endangerment. His business empire was dismantled through asset forfeiture and bankruptcy proceedings, with recovered funds directed toward compensating tenants who had been endangered and supporting veteran services. The broader impact of the Sullivan case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The story sparked national conversations about veteran homelessness, corporate accountability, and the gap between public support for military service and practical support for people who had served. Congressional hearings were scheduled, new policies were proposed, and several cities implemented emergency programs for addressing homelessness among former military personnel. 6 months after the press conference, Sullivan was reunited with his daughter Sarah, who had seen the news coverage and reached out through veterans organizations to reestablish contact. The reunion was awkward and emotional, with years of hurt and misunderstanding to work through, but both father and daughter were committed to rebuilding their relationship. Sarah had her own struggles with understanding her father's trauma, but she also recognized the hero she remembered from childhood in the man who had saved 7 people from a burning building. 1 year after the fire, the city held a dedication ceremony for the new Sullivan Veterans Housing Complex, a facility that provided transitional housing and support services for homeless veterans. The complex was built on the site where Riverside Apartments had once stood, a symbol of transformation from negligence and greed to service and community support. Sullivan cut the ribbon himself, though he insisted the facility be named for Davis and Rodriguez rather than for him. Patricia never remarried and never fully restored her social standing in the circles where she had once moved with such confidence. But she found a different kind of purpose in her work with the Davis Rodriguez Foundation and in the relationships she built with the veteran community. The work was harder and less glamorous than organizing charity galas, but it was also more meaningful and directly connected to the lives of people who needed help. 2 years after that November night, when a homeless man had run toward flames while everyone else ran away, Sullivan was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of Navy SEALs. He told the young warriors about service and sacrifice, about the bonds between teammates that transcend life and death, and about the responsibility they would carry not just to their missions but to each other. As Sullivan finished his remarks to the graduating SEALs, I thought about that night at Riverside Apartments, about the moment when someone we had dismissed as worthless had proven to be worth more than all of us combined. The man on that stage, honored and respected by his community, was the same person who had been sleeping in my alley just 2 years before. The difference was not in Sullivan himself, who had always carried the heart of a warrior and the soul of a protector. The difference was in the rest of us, in our willingness to see dignity, where we had seen only degradation, to recognize service, where we had seen only failure, and to understand that sometimes the people who need our help the most are the ones who have already given us everything. Sometimes it takes a burning building to reveal who people really are, and sometimes it takes a homeless man to make a city remember what honor really means. Have you ever felt indignant when seeing people with merit being forgotten by society? Or tormented when realizing that you have judged someone wrongly? This story was born from those concerns, about justice, about human dignity, about who truly deserves respect. I understand the feeling of helplessness when witnessing injustice, so every story I tell aims to awaken conscience and restore faith in goodness. If you also believe that every person deserves the opportunity to be recognized for their true value, please like and subscribe to Channel Name Stories to spread meaningful stories.